Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Asadullah Ali of the Andalusian Project coming at you today with the very first video of my new web series titled Understanding Jihad with Robert Spencer. Now for those of you out there who don't know what this web series is about, I've actually already produced a preface video linked in the info box in the bibliography where you can go basically watch and learn about what the series is about, what my intentions are behind this series, my intended audience, and what I hope to achieve through this series. So prior to watching this video, please go watch that one if you haven't already. That said, for those of you who have watched that video, just a quick reminder, we are reviewing, analyzing, and deconstructing Robert Spencer's recent book titled The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. And I'm not really going to need to say much after that. Let's just jump right in, right? So let's go to the first thing I want to point out here, and that's his dedication on page 7. And I'm just going to read it out to you guys and then analyze everything that I read, okay? So starting with his dedication, dedicated to the untold millions of victims of jihad from the 7th century to today, may you somehow receive justice. Now, why is this important? Because I know many of you are probably asking me, well, why are you even reading the dedication? What's the point of that? Well, it's very important, and it's actually very relevant, because, believe it or not, there are many implications behind this dedication. Implications that not only undermine Robert Spencer's narrative, but also undermine his moral integrity. Now, you may not think so at first, because it's just a dedication, right? But when he dedicates this to the victims of jihad, you're going to find in subsequent episodes what he really means by this, and how it's actually very damning. So please keep this in mind. Keep this in mind for future episodes, because I will bring it up again, and it will be very, very relevant to the information I'm presenting to you. Now let's skip ahead to his introduction. I won't spend too much time on the introduction, but I do want to read some of it, because it expresses, a summary of what he's trying to present in this book, so you guys get a better understanding of it. Anyways, starting on, page 11, the introduction states the following. This book attempts for the first time in the English language to provide a general overview of jihad activity from the time when the concept of jihad was invented, and arguably even before that, to the present day. From Arabia to North Africa and Persia, from Spain to India, from Tel Aviv to New York City. In amassing this history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, I have endeavored wherever possible to quote the words of contemporary witnesses to the various events described, so that my reader may get some impression of how it was to experience the advance of jihad. So let's stop there for a moment. I'm not going to be pointing out any errors yet, because it's just an introduction and a summary of his book, so I think it would be unfair to do that and rather pedantic, so I'm not going to. But I will say that the first paragraph here, where he says this is the first attempt in the English language to provide a general overview of jihad activity from this time to this time, is false. I can name a couple of books off the top of my head that already did this in a far more erudite and nuanced and comprehensive manner. So, for example, Michael Bonner's Jihad in Islamic History is the first one that comes to mind, and I think something you all should read. It's not perfect by any means. No book is. No non-divine book is, right? The Qur'an is obviously perfect according to Muslims. But I don't know why he said this. Maybe for marketing purposes. Maybe he wanted, his readers to think he was special. Maybe he's ignorant of the other literature. I don't know. But I just found that weird. Let's continue. The accounts included in this book are as noteworthy for what they don't say as for what they do. The attentive reader will note that there is no period since the beginning of Islam that was characterized by large-scale peaceful coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. There was no time when mainstream and dominant Islamic authorities taught the equality of non-Muslims with Muslims or the obsolescence of jihad warfare. There was no era of good feeling, no golden age of tolerance, no paradise of proto-multiculturalism. There has always been, with virtually no interruption, jihad. Nor is jihad in Islamic theology primarily or even prominently anything but warfare against unbelievers. The Qur'an contains numerous exhortations to fight against the infidels, as do all the hadith collections of Muhammad's words and deeds. It directs Muslims to fight those who do not believe in Allah on the last day and do not forbid what Allah and His Messenger have forbidden, nor practice the religion of truth, even if they are the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Nor does Muhammad mention any other pretext for an attack when he expands upon this passage with more detailed instructions on fighting against unbelievers, and then goes on to say, this triple imperative of conversion, subjugation, or death is reinforced in Islamic law, and etc., etc., etc. And he goes on and just continues along the same path. Basically, he's arguing through this book that not only has there been no period of time in Islamic history where Muslims and non-Muslims live peacefully, but that Islamic law and Islamic theology basically order Muslims to fight non-Muslims simply because they're non-Muslims, simply because they disbelieve in Islam. That's basically his book in a nutshell. And for those of you who don't believe this, who think that maybe he didn't say that, he's repeated this claim numerous times in lectures he's given on this very book. So, for example,
there was, all through the history of jihad, state warfare by Islamic entities against non-Muslim entities solely because they were non-Muslim. We see this right from the beginning. Most of you, I'm sure, know that the Quran speaks of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians and some others as people of the book, who have supposedly legitimate revelations from Allah that they have twisted and changed out of their original meanings, and thus they, out of respect for this revelation, they are given the opportunity to live in peace as non-Muslims within the Islamic State. But they have to submit to various humiliating and discriminatory regulations, most notably the tax, the jizya, that's specified in the Quran in chapter 9, verse 29, for the dhimmis, the so-called protected people.
So now that we have the introduction out of the way, let's just jump right into the first chapter. Chapter 1, he titles, I Bring You Slaughter, The Battles of Muhammad, Jihad from 622 to 632 AD. And the subsection title is Victorious with Terror. And he writes the following. He quotes the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in a famous hadith. I have been made victorious with terror. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, died suddenly and unexpectedly, complaining that he felt the way he had several years earlier, when he was poisoned. As death approached, the founder of Islam muttered those fateful words that could have been his epitaph. I have been made victorious with terror. It was a fitting summation of his entire public career. So essentially, Robert Spencer implies here that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was basically arguing, or basically saying that he had been made victorious with terrorism, through terrorism. And he implies this a lot in his lectures and other written articles, like on his blog, Jihad Watch. So this is what he's trying to imply here, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was promoting terrorism. Okay, that he had been made victorious with terrorism. However, there are a number of problems with this implication, with trying to imply this, with this statement. 3 to be exact. So let's just jump right into them. The first of those being that, well, it's literally impossible. It's literally impossible for this statement to be referring to terrorism. And why? Well, because the word terror and the word terrorism didn't become synonymous until the late 18th century, because the word terrorism wasn't coined until the late 18th century. by the political party, the French political party, the Jacobins. And why is this important? Well, because if the word terrorism didn't exist until 11 centuries after the Prophet, peace be upon him, made this statement, then how could the word terror be referring to terrorism? Now, that's not to say that the action of terrorism didn't exist before the 18th century. It obviously did throughout human history. But the word terror and terrorism could not possibly have been synonymous at this point in time because the word terrorism hadn't been invented yet. And although terror is certainly part of terrorism, terrorism has is very much defined as not simply scaring people. It's defined also as the essential aspect of terrorism is to basically kill innocent people and try to coerce them politically and culturally. So, it's actually anachronistic, illogical to claim that this statement is referring to terrorism when the word terrorism hadn't been invented yet. That said, to kind of give you a better understanding of how silly this is, let me give you another example. So imagine if Robert Spencer was quoting William Shakespeare from the 16th and 17th century. And he was quoting his play Henry V. Okay, and in Henry V, William Shakespeare states the following. He says, "Let me speak proudly. Tell the constable we are but warriors for the working day. Our gayness and our guilt are all besmirched, with rainy marching in the painful field." Now, according to Robert Spencer's logic, because Shakespeare says the word gayness, i.e. gay, he must be promoting homosexuality or talking about homosexuality. But this is absurd because during Shakespeare's time, the word gay and homosexuality were not synonymous. They've been made synonymous in contemporary period, 21st century, but back then he was using the word gay in the antiquated sense to mean happy and carefree, etc., etc. So, but according to Robert Spencer's logic, because he says the word gay, it must mean homosexuality, which is absurd. So, in many ways, Robert Spencer is committing a number of fallacies here. The first of them being the fallacy of equivocation, which is essentially using a term in two different ways, fallaciously. And he's also committing the definist fallacy, which is essentially defining something unfairly. And he's doing so in an anachronistic way. So the possible rebuttal to this would be the following. For those of you out there who are saying, well, that shouldn't matter because the prophet's a prophet and revelation's revelation should be for all times and places. Anything he says should be for all times and all places. So it can refer to terrorism because he's a prophet. Well, for those of you out there who don't believe he's a prophet, why are you making this argument? Think about it. In order for you to make this argument, you basically have to admit that he's a prophet. And that's something you don't want to do, right? I mean, that's something you already believe is not true. So why are you saying that? Secondly, to say that it must refer to terrorism, this statement must refer to terrorism, anytime that the Qur'an or the Prophet say the word terror, it has to refer to terrorism, because, revelations for all times and places. Do you understand what revelation means? Do you understand what it means to be for all times and places? To be for all times and places, to be divine text, it has to be objectively understood for all people in all times and all places. It doesn't mean that people can arbitrarily impose definitions on things through all times and places, because if that was the case, then it wouldn't be divine. It would be subjective, to human experience and to human desires. What I mean to say is, if tomorrow the entire world decided to redefine the word terror to mean love and peace, that doesn't suddenly become the definition in the Qur'an and in the Prophet's saying. It doesn't happen that way. That's not how divine text works, right? So, for example, if the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, it was cool outside today. Just because we define the word cool today in a slang as awesome and great doesn't mean that that's what he was referring to. He was probably just saying it was cold outside. It was a little chilly, right? But just because we redefine words or add definitions to terms in later points in life, in later points in history, doesn't mean that that suddenly becomes the definition in the Qur'an or the Prophet Muhammad or in any other religious text. And if you believe it does, then you are simply offering a postmodernist understanding of definitions of meaning and really undermining what it means for a text to be divine. So to me, that doesn't make any sense. But let's move on to the second reason why it's impossible for this statement to be referring to terrorism. And it's because, simply put, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was simply mimicking language, the semantics and phrases of previous Abrahamic scriptures. And the Qur'an is very explicit that its revelation is simply a continuation and confirmation of previous scriptures, so this shouldn't be very surprising. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, if you believe that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is saying that he was made victorious through terrorism, then you as a Christian or you as a Jew must also admit that your own scriptures promote terrorism. So let's quote from the Torah, which is both part of obviously the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures. Starting with Genesis 35, 1 through 5, in the story of Jacob, the prophet. Then God said to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." It continues, finally saying, "Then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them." So essentially, God is saying here that he put terror into local towns so that they would not pursue Jacob and his followers. Let's continue with Exodus 23, chapter 23, 20 through 27. God says, "See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him." He then goes on to say, "I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run." He says, "I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter." And then he goes on to say, "I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run." He then goes on to say in Deuteronomy 11, 22 to 25, God once again, "If you carefully observe all these commands I am giving you to follow, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to hold fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations larger and stronger than you. Every place where you set your foot will be yours. The Lord your God, as he promised you, will put the terror and fear of you on the whole land wherever you go." Fascinating. So here, God is basically saying that the Jewish people, particularly Jacob, were made victorious through terror or with terror made by God. And according to Robert Spencer and many other Christians, since God is also Jesus, this includes Jesus. So by implication, according to Robert Spencer and Christians, if they read terror as terrorism, it means that Jesus is a terrorist. Astaghfirullah. I don't think Robert Spencer wants to admit that, and I don't think it would be fair to claim that God is a terrorist or that his scriptures are promoting terrorism simply because the word terror is present in these texts. I think that would be actually very unfair and out of context, and I'm not going to make that argument. Now, this is not just something that applies to the Abrahamic scriptures, but also to other divine scriptures or considered divine scriptures. So, for example, for all my Hindu audience members, even in your own Vedas, this sort of language is employed. So, for example, in the Vedas, in numerous places, it states the following, and I'll give you just a few examples here. "May you bring near to us those who stand aloof. May you strike terror into our foes. O pure flowing elixir, please transfer the riches to us." In another place it says, He is an ideal commander of the army, who is swift, keeps his arms sharpened, fearless like a strong bull, a zealous killer of foes, strikes terror into men. And in another place it says, let the king Varuna and Manu, the warm emotion, give us the wealth of both kinds earned and gathered. Let our enemies, overwhelmed with terror in their mind and spirit and defeated in their design, run away. So even in the Vedas, apparently, it promotes terrorism because the word terror is used. Of course, I will not make that argument because that would be absurd and unfair. And if the word terror really just means terrorism, and you know, for all of these scriptures, that means that basically the majority of the world are following terrorism, which is, you know, nonsense. Okay. The fact of the matter is that these words, the word terror particularly, cannot be defined in the contemporary sense. They must be defined by how they were used back then. And the word terror is just extreme fear. That's all it is. That's it. Okay? And that in and of itself is not terrorism. And if that was the case, then that means that every scary movie is terrorism. You know, Halloween is National Terrorism Day. Okay, that's nonsense. So, and finally, let's go to the third reason why this statement can't be about terrorism. Not only was the reason the prophet said that, peace be upon him, that he was victorious with terror is because he was mimicking Abrahamic language, and that Allah had made him victorious the same as he had made the Jews, victorious. But his enemies, those he was made victorious over, do not refer to civilians. In fact, there are a number of places in the Qur'an that make this very clear. So, for example, in the Qur'an, it mentions the sort of terror that made the Prophet, peace be upon him, victorious, what he was referring to. And that is an oft-quoted passage by people like Robert Spencer, such as Surah 8, verse 12, which states the following. Remember, when your Lord inspired to the angels, I am with you, so strengthen those who have believed. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve, so strike them upon their necks, and strike from them every fingertip. And the context of this verse is very explicit. Early Islamic scholars made very clear what this verse was about. In fact, the entire chapter. So, for example, Ibn Kathir, writing in the 14th century, notes that this is about the Battle of Badr, something we'll talk about later. And it was between two military forces, two armies. So this text, this particular revelation was revealed, and it's quite evident even in the text without even having to read any commentary. It says, remember, when your Lord inspired to the angels, I am with you, I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieved. So it's telling the Muslim believers to recall a battle, a specific battle, actually the first battle between themselves and the Quraysh pagans, something, like I said, we'll talk about in more detail later. And if you believe fighting between two armies is equivalent to terrorism, then, I'm sorry to break this to you, that would mean that you believe every single war is terrorism. And I don't think that's how the definition should be used. I don't think that's how the term should be used. And I think that's very disingenuous. So, something to think about. Therefore, the Hadith's use of the word terror can only mean terror. It can't mean anything else for those three reasons. It's actually literally impossible for this statement to be implying terrorism. And so it's rather disingenuous that Robert Spencer is using it in this sense. So this would be the first major error in this book. The first error of Robert Spencer's book is found in the first chapter in the very first line. So that should tell you what to expect from subsequent statements of his. If the very first error is in the very first chapter in the very first line, then we already have a major problem here. Going on, though, looking back at this passage that I just read, there's also a minor error here, and I want you to look at footnote number 3, where he states basically, he gives the implication here that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said this as he was on his deathbed or as he was approaching death. So it was very soon before he died. And that's sort of what he's trying to say here. However, the reference that he puts in his footnote doesn't really say this. So if we go to his footnote, it's we find that the reference is Sahih Bukhari, book number 56, number 2977. And the actual hadith is this. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I have been sent with the shortest expressions bearing the widest meanings, and I have been made victorious with terror cast in the hearts of the enemy. And while I was sleeping, the keys of the treasures of the world were brought to me and put in my hand. Abu Huraira added, Allah's Messenger, peace be upon him, has left the world, and now you people are bringing out those treasures, i.e. the Prophet did not benefit by them. Here, there's no implication or nothing explicit or implicit that this statement was made right before he died, meaning like right as he was about to die. It's simply saying that Abu Huraira said that after he left the world, after the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, the things that he had stated, the keys of the treasures of the world, were brought to me and put in my hand, something that he had dreamed was only starting to manifest itself. He wasn't saying this. Abu Huraira was not saying that, oh, Allah's Messenger said this right before he died. There's no implication here of that. There's no explicit or implicit statement here that makes that the case. Maybe it was the case. Maybe he in fact did say that right before he died on his deathbed. But this reference itself doesn't make that clear. So this would be a minor error, error number 2, found in the second paragraph of the first chapter of his book. So let's continue from there. From that point, he goes on to say, the beginnings of Islam are shrouded in mystery. There are thousands upon thousands of reports, hadith plural ahadith or ahadiths, of the words and deeds of Islam's Prophet Muhammad, but virtually all of them date from the 8th and 9th centuries, over a century and a half after Muhammad's death, which is traditionally set in 632. There is considerable reason to believe that the origins of Islam and the lives of its founding figures are quite different from how they're represented in Islamic sacred history. Yet for all of that, those words and deeds of Muhammad, as recorded in the Hadith, are indeed Islamic sacred history and thus are believed and taken as fact by millions of Muslims, many of whom act upon those beliefs daily in various ways. Just as Jesus' words and deeds in the Gospels can be known and studied aside from the questions of their historicity, so also can Muhammad's. The words and deeds of Islam's founder and the various events that formed Islam as a religious and political force form the foundation of Islamic faith to this day. As Islam is an ever-growing presence in the West, these elements of Islam should be known regardless of their historical value or lack thereof. Many of the key events of the life of Muhammad and the 100 years following his death are recorded by early Muslim historians, most likely never happened. But as they are part of Islamic belief in the Islamic worldview to this day, it is important that those whose lives are increasingly affected by these teachings know and understand them. And I apologize, I'm getting a little parched right now. But we're going to end this here, this particular episode on page 16, right before the next subsection, because it's basically just a summary of what he's going to be doing after this. He doesn't agree with the historical truths of many of the Islamic source material, but he's going to state them anyway to present what Islam says about itself. And this is very important because he's going to be using mostly Islamic source material. And we're going to find out how he uses that Islamic source material and whether or not he's actually being objective here with respect to how Islam presents the doctrine of jihad and what it says about jihad. So I want you to keep that in mind if you ever, especially if you're skeptical and you want to say, well, maybe the reason that Robert Spencer didn't bring up certain things is because he doesn't believe that they're historically accurate. Well, but that would be irrelevant, because if he doesn't bring up certain things because they're not historically accurate, that's opposing the methodology that he's presenting here. Remember, it doesn't matter, according to him, whether it's historically accurate or not. What matters is what Islam says about itself. And if you do not include what Islam says about itself, then how can you be abiding by this methodology and having any sort of integrity, right? So keep that in mind for the next episode, because it's going to get a lot more interesting. And we're going to find out exactly how he uses Islamic sources and whether or not he's doing so honestly. So until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode and I hope you learned something today. Jazakallah khaira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.